You're not on the list. The words landed sharp, clean, final, like a door slamming before it even opened. Evelyn Brooks didn't move. Not when the guard stepped closer. Not when his eyes dragged over her fitted black blazer, her simple heels, the absence of anything flashy that might have made him hesitate. The entrance to the auction hall glowed behind him. Crystal lights, polished marble, a room built for people who were used to being seen. And in his eyes, she wasn't one of them. The line behind her shifted. A man in a tailored navy suit glanced at his watch. A woman in diamonds exhaled, impatient. The air wasn't loud, but it was watching. Evelyn's gaze stayed steady, calm, measured. Check again, she said, her voice low, even. The guard didn't reach for the tablet. Didn't scan. He shook his head once, already done. Private event, he added, like that explained everything. Like that settled it. A second staff member approached. White, mid-40s, clipboard in hand. Smile tight, but not kind. She didn't greet Evelyn. She assessed her. A glance. A pause. A conclusion already made. We can't hold up entry, she said, just loud enough for others to hear. Not shouting, but not quiet either. The kind of volume meant to define a moment. Behind them, the doors opened briefly, just enough for laughter to spill out, for a glimpse of velvet chairs and raised paddles and wealth moving like it belonged there. Then they closed again, and Evelyn was still on the outside. A hand gestured, not aggressive, not forceful, but dismissive, directional, away. The kind of motion that didn't need to touch you to move you. The crowd shifted again. Eyes lingered. Someone whispered. Not loud enough to quote. Just loud enough to confirm what the room had already decided. Evelyn exhaled slowly. Not frustration. Not defeat. Just breath. She looked past them for a second, at the doors, at the light, at the space she was being denied. Then back at the woman in front of her. You're sure? She asked. 3 words. No edge. No anger. Just certainty wrapped in a question. The woman gave a small, confident nod. Absolutely. And that was it. The decision sealed. The moment closed. Evelyn didn't argue. Didn't raise her voice. She simply turned. One step. Then another. Heels clicking softly against stone as she walked away from a room that thought it had already measured her worth. The night air outside was cooler. Quieter. But something about it felt sharper now, like the world had just shifted by half an inch. Evelyn reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and paused for exactly 1 second before dialing. When the line picked up, her voice didn't change. It's time, she said. A beat of silence on the other end. Then, understood. Evelyn ended the call. Looked back at the entrance one more time. The doors hadn't changed. The people hadn't either. But something else had. And in exactly 20 minutes, that same room was going to realize the mistake it had just made. The sidewalk outside the auction hall was quieter than it should have been. But Evelyn Brooks did not slow down as she stepped beneath the soft glow of the streetlights. Her reflection briefly catching in the glass facade behind her like a ghost the building had already dismissed. And for a moment she stood still, not lost, not uncertain, just present. As if the entire city had narrowed down to this single point in time where patience mattered more than reaction, and she had mastered that long ago. A black sedan pulled up to the curb with precise timing, the kind that did not happen by accident, and the driver stepped out quickly, opening the rear door without asking a single question, because he already knew exactly who she was, even if the people inside that building did not. And Evelyn slid into the seat without hesitation, her posture unchanged, her expression unreadable, her phone already in her hand again as the door closed softly behind her, sealing off the noise of the street. Like a scene being cut clean from a film. Status, she said, her voice calm, measured, controlled, and on the other end there was no confusion, no delay, only readiness. The confirmation is complete, the voice replied, sharp and efficient. Ownership transfer finalized at 7:42 p.m., all documentation verified and logged. And Evelyn glanced at the time on her screen, the seconds moving forward with quiet precision, each one pulling the world closer to a shift no one inside that auction hall was prepared for. Outside, traffic moved in slow lines, headlights stretching across the pavement like quiet witnesses, but inside the car, everything felt still, contained, deliberate, and Evelyn leaned back slightly, not in relief, not in comfort, but in control, the kind that did not need to be announced because it was already absolute. She remembered another night years ago, standing outside a different building, different city, same look in someone's eyes, the same quiet dismissal dressed up as procedure, and back then she had stood there longer, wondering if she needed to prove something, if she needed to speak louder, dress differently, become something easier for them to accept. But that version of her did not last. It evolved, sharpened, and learned that real power did not argue for space. It claimed it without permission. "Prepare entry," she said, her tone unchanged, and the response came instantly. "They are not aware yet." And for the first time, the corner of Evelyn's gaze shifted slightly toward the direction of the building, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, because awareness was never required for consequence. And inside those walls, the auction was continuing as if nothing had happened. Bidders raising paddles, voices low and confident, deals unfolding in a room that believed it was in control of its own narrative, unaware that the ground beneath it had already changed ownership without a single announcement. The car engine remained running, steady, quiet, like a held breath, and Evelyn looked down at her reflection in the dark screen of her phone, not searching for anything, just acknowledging the moment. Then she lifted her eyes again, sharper now, more focused, as if something invisible had clicked into place, and outside, the same doors that had closed on her minutes ago stood unchanged, guarded, certain, but certainty had a way of collapsing when it was built on assumption, and Evelyn Brooks had spent her entire life turning assumptions into endings. And as the seconds continued to pass, one truth settled in without resistance, without noise, without doubt. They had not just turned her away. They had invited something far greater back in. Inside the auction hall, nothing had changed, and that was exactly the problem. Crystal chandeliers cast a steady glow across polished marble floors. The hum of quiet conversations moved like currency between clusters of well-dressed guests. And at the center of it all, the auctioneer stood poised behind a sleek podium, his voice smooth, practiced, carrying the rhythm of wealth and motion as paddles lifted and lowered with confident ease. Numbers climbing in calm increments, each bid a silent declaration of power, and near the entrance, the same staff who had turned Evelyn away minutes earlier resumed their positions with subtle satisfaction, their posture relaxed again, their certainty restored, because in their minds, the disruption had been handled, corrected, removed. The guard adjusted his jacket, glancing briefly toward the doors as if checking that the situation had truly ended, while the woman with the clipboard leaned closer to another staff member, her voice low but edged with quiet validation. "You can always tell," she said, not needing to finish the sentence, because the assumption spoke louder than any explanation, and a few feet away, a young assistant lingered, her eyes drifting back toward the entrance more often than necessary, something unsettled in her expression, something that did not align with the confidence the others carried, because she had seen the way Evelyn stood, the way she spoke, the way she did not argue, and it did not match the story they had already decided to believe. Near the front, a man in a tailored gray suit raised his paddle again, the auctioneer nodding with approval as the price climbed past $2 million, the room tightening with anticipation, the kind that fed on control and exclusivity, the belief that everyone present had earned their place within these walls. And yet just beyond those doors, a shift had already occurred, invisible but irreversible, like a contract signed in silence that would soon echo louder than any bid. Back at the entrance, the young assistant finally spoke, her voice hesitant but clear enough to cut through the low chatter. "Should we verify the list again?" she asked, her eyes flicking toward the tablet. But the response came quickly, dismissive. "There is nothing to verify," the clipboard woman replied, her tone clipped, final, as if questioning the moment itself was the only mistake left to correct, and the assistant nodded slowly, stepping back into silence. But her gaze did not settle. It lingered, watching, waiting, as if something in the air had not fully reset. The doors remained closed. The event continued. The illusion of control held firm, but beneath it, tension began to form in small, almost imperceptible ways, a slight delay in the auctioneer's cadence, a glance exchanged between two guests who could not quite explain why the room suddenly felt different, heavier. as if something unseen had entered without announcement. And then, from somewhere near the back, a subtle shift in attention began, not loud, not immediate, just a ripple, a pause, a quiet awareness moving through the space as one staff member looked toward the entrance again, then another, until the certainty that had filled the room minutes earlier started to thin, not because anyone had said a word, but because something about the moment no longer aligned with the story they had convinced themselves was true. And outside those doors, timing was no longer on their side. The ripple became a pause, and the pause became attention, as the doors at the far end of the hall opened again, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet precision that did not match the energy of interruption, and for a second, no one spoke, not the auctioneer, not the guests, not even the staff who had been so certain just minutes before, because something about the way those doors moved carried weight, the kind that did not ask permission to be noticed. A man in a dark suit stepped. In first, posture straight, expression composed, the kind of presence that belonged to people who did not wait to be acknowledged, and behind him, two more followed, their pace measured, their eyes scanning the room not with curiosity but with authority, and then the space between them widened slightly, just enough to reveal her. Evelyn Brooks stepped through the doorway again, her stride steady, unchanged, but the room received her differently now, not because she had altered anything about herself, but because the context around her had shifted, and context, in rooms like this, was everything. The young assistant near the entrance froze first, her breath catching in a way she could not explain, while the clipboard woman straightened instinctively, her expression tightening, recalculating, searching for something that would restore the certainty she had lost, but nothing came. The guard who had blocked Evelyn earlier stepped forward by habit, then stopped halfway, something in his training conflicting with something he could not yet name, because the men beside Evelyn were not guests, they were not staff, they were something else entirely, and the difference was undeniable. The auctioneer cleared his throat softly, his voice attempting to resume. "We have 3 million going once." But the words did not land the same. They floated, disconnected, as attention pulled away from the podium and toward the entrance, toward the shift that had just walked back into the room. Whispers began, not sharp, not loud, but layered, building, moving from one guest to another like a current no one could stop. "Who is that?" someone murmured, while another leaned closer, eyes narrowing, recognition almost forming but not yet complete. The man who had entered first turned slightly, speaking just low enough that only those closest could hear. "All operations pause," he said, and even though the sentence was quiet, it carried through the space like a command that did not need volume to be obeyed, because within seconds, the auctioneer stopped mid-sentence. The staff near the front desk stepped back, and the subtle machinery of the event slowed, then stilled. Evelyn did not rush. She did not look around for approval. She simply walked forward, each step measured, deliberate, her gaze level, her presence anchoring the room in a way that made everything else feel temporary. The clipboard woman swallowed, her confidence slipping in small, visible cracks, and for the first time since the night began, she spoke without certainty. "Ma'am, this is a restricted," but the words did not finish, because the man beside Evelyn turned his head slightly and said, "She has full access." And that was all it took, not an explanation, not a justification, just a statement placed exactly where it needed to be. The room did not erupt, it did not react loudly, but it shifted, deeply, unmistakably, like something structural had just been revealed beneath the surface. And as Evelyn Brooks moved further into the space that had denied her minutes ago, the truth began to press in on everyone at once, slow, heavy, undeniable. They had not just misjudged her, they had misjudged the entire room. The room did not breathe the same anymore. It held itself, tight, suspended, as Evelyn Brooks continued forward with the same calm precision that had defined her from the moment she first appeared. But now every step echoed differently, not because the floor had changed, but because the people watching had. And near the entrance, the guard who had denied her minutes earlier felt it first, that quiet collapse of certainty, his posture stiffening as his eyes followed her, searching for something that would explain why the situation no longer belonged to him, while beside him, the clipboard woman adjusted her grip, the edges of authority slipping through her fingers in ways she could not control, her voice gone, her earlier confidence dissolving into silence. At the center of the room, the auctioneer stood still, hands resting on the podium, his script abandoned mid-sentence as he looked toward the figures approaching, unsure whether to resume or wait, because whatever this moment was, it did not follow the rules he was used to, and across the room, guests who had arrived expecting control now found themselves watching it shift, their attention no longer on the items being sold, but on the woman who had just re-entered the space, as if the entire event had quietly realigned around her presence. The young assistant near the entrance stepped forward again, slower this time, her voice barely above a whisper as she turned to the clipboard woman. "Who is she?" And for the first time, there was no immediate answer, only a pause that stretched too long, revealing more than any explanation could have. Evelyn reached the center aisle, stopping just short of the front row, her gaze sweeping the room not with curiosity, but with recognition, as if she had seen this scene before, not this exact place, but this pattern, this structure of power built on assumptions, and she had learned long ago how quickly those structures could fall. The man beside her leaned slightly toward the auctioneer and spoke in a tone that did not invite discussion. "You may hold the sale," he said, and the phrasing alone shifted something deeper, not stop, not cancel, but hold, as if the entire event now existed under a different authority, and the auctioneer nodded almost immediately, stepping back half an inch, a small movement that signaled a much larger change. A guest near the front, a man who had been leading the bids just moments earlier, lowered his paddle slowly, his confidence replaced by calculation, his eyes moving between Evelyn and the men beside her as if trying to piece together a puzzle that had already been solved without him. The clipboard woman finally found her voice, though it came softer now, uncertain. "Ma'am, if there has been a misunderstanding, we can," but Evelyn lifted her hand slightly, not dismissive, not aggressive, just enough to pause the sentence before it could continue, and the room felt that gesture, the quiet control within it, the absence of urgency that only came from someone who no longer needed to prove anything. "There was no misunderstanding," Evelyn said, her voice even, clear, carrying across the room without effort, and the simplicity of the statement landed heavier than any accusation could have, because it removed the possibility of excuse, leaving only the truth standing in its place. A ripple moved through the guests again, stronger this time, more defined, as recognition began to form not in full clarity but in fragments, a name almost remembered, a face seen somewhere before, a shift in tone that suggested this moment was no longer unfolding randomly. It was revealing something that had already been decided. And as Evelyn stood there, centered, composed, the realization began to settle into the room like a slow, inevitable tide. Whatever authority had existed before she returned was no longer the authority that mattered, and the people who had enforced it were now standing inside a moment they could no longer control. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling into the walls, into the polished floor, into every pair of eyes that now followed Evelyn Brooks, as if the room itself had shifted its center of gravity toward her. And for a moment no one moved, because movement implied certainty, and certainty was the one thing slipping away from everyone except her. The clipboard woman took a step forward, slower this time, her heels no longer carrying the same confidence, her voice measured but strained at the edges. "Ma'am, if there has been any inconvenience, we can resolve this privately." And the word privately hung in the air like an attempt to shrink what had already grown too large to contain. But Evelyn did not move closer, did not lower her voice. She simply looked at her, steady, unblinking, and in that gaze there was no anger, only clarity, the kind that made excuses feel smaller before they were even spoken. "You had your chance to resolve it," Evelyn said, her tone even, controlled, and the room absorbed it in full, every syllable landing without resistance, because nothing about her delivery invited interruption, and the clipboard woman's lips parted slightly as if to respond, then closed again, the words dissolving before they could take form. Near the entrance, the young assistant stepped forward again, this time not asking permission, her voice quiet but firm as she spoke to the men beside Evelyn. "Can someone explain what is happening?" and one of them turned his head just enough to acknowledge her, his response calm, precise. Ownership has been transferred as of 20 minutes ago, he said, and the sentence moved through the room like a current, not loud, not explosive, but undeniable, because it carried a weight that could not be dismissed, and for a second, the room did not react. It processed, slowly, collectively, the meanings settling in piece by piece. The auctioneer straightened behind the podium, his eyes widening just enough to betray the shift in his understanding, while the man in the front row who had been leading the bids leaned back in his chair, his earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, more cautious, his paddle now resting motionless in his hand. The clipboard woman's composure fractured in small, visible ways, her shoulders tightening, her gaze flickering between Evelyn and the men beside her as if searching for a contradiction that did not exist. That is not possible, she said, but even her own voice lacked conviction, because possibility had already been replaced by fact. Evelyn took one step forward, not aggressive, not rushed, just enough to close the space between them by inches, and in that small movement, the power dynamic completed its shift. It already happened, she said, and the simplicity of it left no room for negotiation, no space for denial, only the truth standing where their assumptions used to be. A murmur rose among the guests, louder now, more defined, fragments of realization connecting into a single understanding, and the young assistant's eyes widened as she looked at Evelyn again, not with doubt this time, but with recognition, as if the pieces had finally aligned in her mind. The guard near the door stepped back without being told, his earlier authority dissolving into something quieter, more cautious, because the rules he had enforced minutes ago no longer applied in the same way, and he could feel it without needing it explained. Evelyn's gaze moved across the room once more, not searching, not questioning, simply acknowledging the space as it existed now. And when she spoke again, her voice did not rise, it did not need to. Continue the auction, she said, and the command settled into the room with finality, because this time, it was not a request, it was direction, and for the first time that night, everyone understood exactly who it was coming from. The room obeyed before it realized it was obeying, the auctioneer straightening, clearing his throat, his voice returning but altered now, less certain, more aware. We will resume at 3 million, he said, and this time the words felt different, like they were being spoken inside someone else's authority, because they were. Evelyn Brooks did not sit in the back, did not step aside. She moved forward and took a seat near the front, not with urgency, not with display, just with quiet inevitability, as if that space had always been hers and the room was only now catching up to that fact. And as she settled in, the subtle choreography of the event reformed around her presence, staff repositioning, guests adjusting, conversations lowering, everything aligning to a new center without needing to be instructed. The man who had been leading the bids glanced at her again, his grip on the paddle tightening slightly before loosening, his confidence recalibrating into something more cautious, because bidding in a room like this was never just about money. It was about position, and his position had just shifted without warning. Behind Evelyn, the clipboard woman stood frozen for a moment too long, then stepped back slowly, her earlier authority dissolving into something quieter, almost invisible, as if she understood that speaking now would only make the contrast sharper. And near the entrance, the guard remained still, no longer scanning the line, no longer directing movement, just watching, learning in real time that the rules he had enforced were not the rules that mattered. 3 million going once, the auctioneer repeated, his voice steadier now, but still carrying the awareness of the shift that had taken place, and a paddle lifted from the far side of the room. Then another, the numbers climbing again, but the rhythm had changed, slower, more deliberate, as if every bid now passed through a layer of hesitation that had not existed before. Evelyn did not raise a paddle, not yet. She simply watched, her expression composed, her presence enough to influence the room without a single action, and that was the part no one had prepared for, the part that made the atmosphere feel heavier, because control was no longer being performed, it was being held. A guest leaned toward another, whispering something that traveled no further than the space between them, but the meaning spread anyway, recognition forming in fragments, a name remembered, A headline recalled, a realization that moved from uncertainty to clarity with each passing second, and the young assistant near the entrance finally understood fully, her eyes widening as she looked from Evelyn to the men beside her, then back again. The entire picture locking into place, the clipboard. Woman took a breath, stepping forward once more, this time carefully, her voice lower, measured. "Ms. Brooks," she said, the name landing in the open air for the first time, and the effect was immediate, subtle but undeniable, like a key turning in a lock that had been resisting all night. Because names carried weight, and this one carried more than most. Evelyn did not turn right away. She let the moment settle. Let the room absorb what had just been said. Then she shifted her gaze slightly, acknowledging the voice without giving it more than it had earned. And in that small gesture, the hierarchy completed its transformation, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet finality that left no doubt. The room had changed, and it was not changing back. For a brief second, the room returned to motion, paddles lifting again, numbers climbing, voices settling back into their polished rhythm. But beneath it all, something quieter had taken hold, something heavier, because now every action carried awareness, and Evelyn Brooks sat still at the center of it, not participating, not interrupting, simply existing in a way that reshaped everything around her without effort. The auctioneer continued, his tone steady but more measured than before. 3,500,000, he called, and a paddle rose from the right side, followed by another from the back, the competition resuming. But it no longer felt like a performance of control. It felt observed, evaluated, as if the room itself had become accountable to something it could not ignore. Evelyn's gaze remained forward, calm, focused, but her mind drifted for a moment, not away from the room, but deeper into it, into the pattern she had seen before, the same pattern that had followed her for years, spaces defined by access, by quiet judgments made in seconds, by doors that opened easily for some and closed without explanation for others. She remembered a hallway years ago, not as grand as this one, not lined with marble or glass, but just as decisive, standing there with a folder in her hand, waiting while someone on the other side of a desk flipped through her credentials with a polite smile that never reached their eyes. "We are looking for a different fit," they had said, and she had nodded then, just like she had nodded tonight, not because she agreed, but because she understood something they did not. That rejection based on perception was never final. It was temporary, and temporary things could be rewritten. Back in the present, a bid reached 4 million, the number echoing briefly before settling into the room, and Evelyn blinked once, returning fully, her posture unchanged, her presence just as steady, but something in her gaze had sharpened, not with emotion, but with clarity, the kind that came from recognizing a pattern and knowing exactly how it would end. Near the entrance, the young assistant watched her closely now, not with curiosity anymore, but with something closer to respect, as if she had just witnessed a shift she would not forget. While the clipboard woman remained still, her earlier confidence replaced by careful silence, her role in the room reduced without a single formal announcement. A guest near the front leaned toward another again, whispering more urgently this time, the name spoken quietly but distinctly, and the reaction that followed was immediate, subtle but undeniable, heads turning slightly, eyes narrowing with recognition, the kind that spread faster than any announcement ever could. The auctioneer raised his hand again, preparing to move the bid forward, but paused for a fraction of a second longer than before, his eyes flicking toward Evelyn, not seeking approval, but acknowledging presence. And in that pause, the hierarchy of the room revealed itself fully, not in titles, not in roles, but in attention. Evelyn did not respond to the glance. She did not need to, because the moment had already answered itself, and as the auction resumed once more, the truth settled into every corner of the space, quiet, unshakable. This was no longer just an event. It was a reckoning unfolding in real time, and everyone in the room was now part of it. The number climbed again, 4,200,000. The auctioneer called, but his voice no longer carried the same effortless confidence. It carried awareness now, a careful precision, as if every word had to pass through a new filter before it could be spoken. And in the front row, Evelyn Brooks finally moved, not dramatically, not suddenly. Just a slight shift of her hand as she reached for the paddle resting beside her chair, and the motion alone was enough to quiet the room in a way no announcement could have achieved. She did not raise it immediately. She let the moment breathe, let the attention settle fully, because timing was never about speed. It was about control, and when she finally lifted the paddle, it was smooth, deliberate, undeniable. For .5 million, the auctioneer said, almost automatically, but the moment the number left his mouth, the room reacted, not loudly, but deeply, a ripple of recognition and realization moving through the guests like a current that could not be stopped. Because this was not just a bid, it was a declaration, a quiet confirmation of everything that had been revealed without words. The man who had been leading before hesitated, his paddle half raised, then lowered again, his confidence interrupted by something he could not quantify, because competing now meant stepping into a position that no longer felt secure, and across the room, others followed the same instinct, small movements of restraint, of reconsideration, as if the presence of Evelyn had redefined the value of participation itself. The clipboard woman watched. From the side, her expression tightened, her earlier certainty now replaced by a careful stillness, and near the entrance, the young assistant allowed herself a small breath, as if witnessing the final piece of a story fall into place. The auctioneer cleared his throat again, his voice steadier but more respectful now. For .5 million going once, he said, his eyes flicking toward Evelyn for the briefest moment, not for approval, but for acknowledgement, and she gave none, because she did not need to. Her presence was already enough. Silence followed, heavier than before, stretching just long enough to confirm what everyone in the room was beginning to understand. No one challenged the bid. No one stepped forward to reclaim control, because control had already shifted, completely, irreversibly. Going twice. The auctioneer continued, and the words felt final even before they reached their end, because the outcome had already been decided the moment Evelyn chose to act. The gavel came down softly, not loud, not dramatic, but definitive. Sold, he said, and the sound marked more than the end of a transaction. It marked the completion of a transformation that had begun the moment she was turned away at the door. Evelyn lowered the paddle with the same calm she had raised it, her expression unchanged, but the room around her was no longer the same room. It had been reordered, realigned, its hierarchy rewritten in real time, and as the results settled into every corner of the space, one truth became impossible to ignore. She had not just entered the room, she had taken it back. The sound of the gavel did not fade quickly. It lingered in the room like a quiet verdict that no one could appeal. And for a moment no one moved, because movement would have meant pretending nothing had changed, and nothing about this moment was ordinary anymore. Evelyn Brooks remained seated, her hand resting lightly against the paddle as if it had never carried weight, as if the decision she had just made required no effort at all. And that was what unsettled the room the most. Not the amount, not the outcome, but the ease with which she had claimed it. The auctioneer adjusted his stance behind the podium, his voice returning carefully, almost respectfully now. Congratulations, he said, his tone directed toward her, no longer to the room. And that shift alone confirmed what everyone already felt. This was no longer a shared space of power. It had narrowed, centered, and everyone else was now orbiting around it. The man who had been bidding earlier leaned back fully in his chair, his posture no longer competitive but reflective, as if he was recalculating not the loss, but the misjudgment that had led him to underestimate the person sitting just a few feet away. And across the room, other guests followed the same pattern, subtle shifts in posture, in expression, in attention, each one acknowledging what had just taken place without needing to say it out loud. Near the entrance, the clipboard woman stood completely still, her earlier authority gone without announcement, replaced by a quiet awareness of her own role in the moment that had just unfolded. And for the first time, she did not step forward, did not speak, because there was nothing left to manage, nothing left to correct, only something to face. The young assistant beside her lowered her gaze briefly, then lifted it again toward Evelyn, her expression no longer uncertain, but resolute, as if she had just witnessed a lesson she would carry long after the night ended. Evelyn finally stood, not abruptly, not ceremoniously, just a smooth, natural motion that drew every eye in the room again. And as she turned slightly, the light caught her in a way that made her presence feel even more defined, not because of what she wore, but because of what she carried, a certainty that did not need to be announced. One of the men beside her stepped forward slightly, holding a slim folder, but Evelyn raised her hand just enough to pause him, her focus still on the room, not on the paperwork, not on the transaction, because this moment was not about documents. It was about clarity. She took a single step forward, her voice calm, steady, carrying across the room without effort. "The sale will continue," she said, and the words landed with quiet authority, not as a suggestion, not as a courtesy, but as a direction that redefined the purpose of the event itself. And the auctioneer nodded immediately, almost instinctively, because resistance no longer existed in a room that had already shifted this far. A low murmur followed, not confusion, not disagreement, but adjustment, as if everyone present was aligning themselves with a new reality in real time. And as Evelyn stood there, centered, composed, one truth settled into every corner of the space. She had not just won the bid. She had taken control of everything that came after it. The room had already shifted, but now it began to settle into something new, something defined not by assumption but by recognition. And as Evelyn Brooks stood at the center of it all, the weight of what had happened became clearer with every passing second. Not louder, not more dramatic, just more real, more undeniable. The clipboard woman finally stepped forward again, slower than before, her posture no longer leading but following, her voice carefully measured as she spoke. "Ms. Brooks, I want to personally apologize for earlier." And the words, though polite, carried the strain of someone trying to repair a moment that could not be undone, because apologies in rooms like this were not about what was said, they were about what had already been revealed. Evelyn turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting the woman's, calm, steady, without hostility, but without softness either. And in that look there was a boundary, clear and quiet, the kind that did not need to be explained. "You were clear," Evelyn said, her tone even, and the simplicity of the statement removed any space for reinterpretation, because clarity, once exposed, could not be softened into misunderstanding. The woman's expression tightened, not in defiance, but in recognition, as if she understood that the moment she had created would follow her long after this night ended. And she nodded once, stepping back, her role in the room now permanently altered. Near the entrance, the young assistant moved forward with more confidence than before, approaching one of the men beside Evelyn, her voice respectful but steady. "Is there anything you need me to update?" she asked, and the response came with a brief nod. "Continue operations as scheduled," he said, and the exchange, simple as it was, marked a quiet shift, not just in authority, but in alignment. Because she was no longer waiting to be told what the room was, she understood it. Across the floor, guests resumed their conversations, but the tone had changed, no longer casual, no longer effortless, now layered with awareness, with recalculation, as if everyone present was adjusting their understanding of what had just taken place, and more importantly, what it meant for them. The auctioneer cleared his throat again, his voice returning with a renewed precision. "We will proceed with the next item," he announced, but even as he spoke, his eyes moved briefly toward Evelyn, acknowledging her presence not as a guest, but as the defining force within the room. Evelyn did not respond to the glance. She did not need to, because acknowledgement had already been established, not through words, but through action, through outcome, through the undeniable shift that had taken place in less than half an hour. She took a step forward, her voice calm, measured, carrying just enough to reach the front of the room. "Make sure every transaction tonight is reviewed," she said, and the instruction landed immediately, not questioned, not delayed, because the authority behind it was no longer something anyone in the room could ignore. The man beside her nodded, already moving to relay the directive. And in that moment, the final layer of the shift became clear. This was no longer about entry, or recognition, or even the auction itself. It was about control, complete and unquestioned. Evelyn's gaze moved once more across the room, not searching, not challenging, simply observing. And as the space continued to operate under her direction, One truth settled in fully, not just for the people who had doubted her, but for everyone watching. She had not raised her voice. She had not forced her way in. She had simply allowed the truth to arrive, and when it did, it changed everything. The room no longer questioned her presence. It adjusted to it completely, and what had once been a controlled environment built on quiet assumptions now moved with a different rhythm, one shaped by accountability rather than appearance. And as Evelyn Brooks stood near the center aisle, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, the final layer of the shift began to unfold. One of the senior coordinators approached cautiously, holding a tablet, his voice respectful, precise. "We have initiated a review of all access protocols," he said, and Evelyn gave a slight nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, because this was no longer about reaction, it was about correction. Near the entrance, the guard who had turned her away earlier stood still, his gaze lowered briefly before lifting again, not in defiance, not in fear, but in recognition of something he had not understood before, and beside him, the clipboard woman remained quiet, her earlier authority replaced by reflection, the kind that came too late to change the moment, but early enough to change what came after. Across the room, guests who had once been passive observers now carried a different awareness, their conversations softer, more deliberate, as if each person understood they had just witnessed more than an auction. They had witnessed a system reveal itself and then be corrected in real time. Evelyn took a slow step forward, her voice calm but clear as she spoke again, effective immediately. "All guest verification processes will be standardized and logged," she said, and the directive moved quickly through the staff, not questioned, not delayed, because the authority behind it had already been proven beyond doubt. The young assistant near the entrance straightened slightly, her attention focused, absorbing every word, every shift, as if this moment was becoming a blueprint for how things should have always been handled. The auctioneer resumed the flow of the event with renewed discipline, each announcement sharper, more precise, as if the room itself had been recalibrated, and in that recalibration, something deeper settled, a new standard, not written, but understood. Evelyn's gaze moved once more across the space, not searching for fault, not holding on to the moment of disrespect, but marking the transformation, because what mattered now was not what had happened at the door, it was what would never happen again inside these walls. The clipboard woman finally spoke again, her voice quieter than before. "It will not happen again," she said, not as a defense, but as a statement of intent, and Evelyn looked at her for a brief second, long enough for the weight of accountability to settle, then turned away, because the lesson had already been delivered. The room continued, the auction moving forward, bids rising again, but everything about it felt different now, more grounded, more aware, as if the illusion that once held it together had been replaced by something real, something earned. And as Evelyn Brooks stood there, no longer needing to prove anything, one truth became permanent in that space. Respect was no longer optional. It was built into the system itself, and the people who had once controlled the room were now part of a structure they could no longer bend. The auction continued, but it no longer felt like a performance of status. It felt like a system that had been forced to see itself clearly. And as the final items moved across the stage, one by one, the room carried a different kind of silence, not empty, not tense, but aware, as if every person present understood they had just witnessed something that would stay with them long after the night ended. Evelyn Brooks stood near the front, no longer needing to move, no longer needing to speak, because everything that needed to be said had already been delivered through action, through presence, through the quiet precision of timing that had turned a moment of exclusion into a complete reversal of power. The auctioneer called the final lot, his voice steady, composed, but respectful in a way it had not been before, and when the gavel came down for the last time, the sound did not echo as loudly as the first. Because the real impact of the night had already passed, it had already reshaped the room in ways no single sale could match. Guests began to rise slowly, conversations returning in low tones, but now those conversations carried reflection, carried awareness, as if each person was measuring what they had seen against what they believed before they walked in, and near the entrance, the guard stepped aside without being told as Evelyn approached, not out of routine, but out of understanding. His posture different now, not enforcing, but acknowledging. The clipboard woman stood nearby, her voice quiet when she spoke. "Thank you for staying," she said, not as a courtesy, but as recognition, and Evelyn paused for just a second, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged. "Make sure the next person does not have to prove they belong," she replied. And the sentence settled into the space with more weight than any instruction that had come before it, because it was not about her anymore. It was about what came next. The young assistant stood a few steps behind, watching, absorbing every word, every detail, as if this moment had drawn a line in her understanding of how the world worked and how it should work. And as Evelyn moved toward the exit, the doors opened before she reached them, not delayed, not questioned, just open, the way they should have been from the beginning. Outside, the night air felt the same as before, cool, steady, unchanged, but something else had shifted. Something internal, something permanent, and as she stepped out, the city lights stretching beyond her, the building behind her no longer defined her, because it never had. She had defined it the moment she chose not to react, but to return, and inside, long after she left, the room remained different, not because of a rule written down, but because of a truth revealed. That power does not announce itself. It waits, it observes. And when the moment comes, it does not ask for permission. It simply takes its place. And as the last lights dimmed and the final guest stepped out into the night, one understanding remained, clear, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. She did not need to belong to that room. The room had always belonged to her.